December 5th, 1941. Outside Moscow, 3 o'clock in the morning. The temperature is 30 degrees below 0 Celsius. Figures move through the dark. They wear white camouflage smocks over thick winter uniforms, and they move on skis across ground that has been frozen solid for weeks. They carry PPSH submachine guns, barrels wrapped in cloth against the cold. They advance in silence, hundreds of them, then thousands, across a front that stretches for miles in both directions, and the German units dug into the earth ahead of them have no idea they're coming. The German High Command did not know these men existed. 6 months earlier, on the 22nd of June, 1941, the most powerful military force ever assembled had crossed into Soviet territory. 4 million Soviet casualties in 6 months. 3 million prisoners, and most of them starving in improvised camps where German policy, not incidentally, not through neglect but by design, would kill 2 million of them before winter ended. 40% of the Soviet Union's industrial capacity gone. The largest air force in the world, destroyed on the ground in the first 72 hours. Entire armies swallowed whole in encirclements so vast they had no precedent in the history of warfare. The most lethal military operation in history had just been completed. The Soviet army, by every measure Germany possessed, was finished. And yet, something was in the snow. What it was, and how it came to be there, begins 6 months earlier. This was not ordinary military resilience. It was a civilization surviving a wound that should have been fatal. The opening weeks of Operation Barbarossa did not feel like a war. They felt like a collapse. 3.5 million German and Axis troops struck along a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea, and the Soviet formations in their path did not retreat. They disintegrated. At Bialystok and Minsk in the first 2 weeks, entire Soviet army groups were encircled before they fully understood what was happening. Their communications were cut, their commanders killed or captured, their fuel dumps taken before their tank crews could reach them. Columns of Soviet prisoners, tens of thousands at a time, then hundreds of thousands, shuffled eastward under minimal German guards. There were too many of them for anything else. Georgy Zhukov, a peasant son from Kaluga province, a cavalryman from the First World War, yet a man who had risen to command, despite every purge that came for officers of his generation, had argued in May 1941 for a preemptive Soviet strike against the gathering German forces. Stalin overruled him. In the weeks before the invasion, Zhukov issued orders to Soviet border commanders that capture, in a single document, the fatal miscalculation of the entire preceding period. When Soviet troops along the frontier moved forward into defensive positions, Zhukov ordered them back. His words: "Such action could provoke the Germans into armed confrontation, fraught with all sorts of consequences." The order was sent 11 days before Germany invaded. The men who died in the first hours of June 22nd died partly because the state they served had convinced itself, against all evidence, thus against Zhukov's own warnings, that it could not yet be attacked. Kiev was the catastrophe beyond catastrophes. 4 complete Soviet armies, the 5th, 37th, 26th, and 21st, were encircled in a single operation that consumed 6 weeks and produced nearly 700,000 prisoners. 43 divisions, gone. After Kiev, the Red Army no longer outnumbered the German forces anywhere along the front. There were no more trained reserves immediately available. To defend Moscow, Stalin could field 800,000 men in 83 divisions, but fewer than 25 of those divisions were fully combat effective. By early December, a German reconnaissance battalion had reached the town of Khimki, 8 kilometers from the Soviet capital. From the right elevation, on a clear day, they could see the spires of the Kremlin, and they were looking at the center of the Soviet state from a field at its edge. Germany had just achieved the most complete military victory in the history of modern warfare. By every calculation the German High Command had made, this was enough. The Soviet state should now collapse. Hitler had said it plainly. Kick in the door and the whole rotten structure comes crashing down. The door had been kicked in. The structure had not come down. The reason lives in a number that Germany never put in its calculations. While German intelligence was measuring the Soviet army, counting its divisions, mapping its air bases, estimating its reserves, it was measuring the wrong thing. What it did not measure, could not measure, was the depth of trained manpower the Soviet state had been quietly accumulating for more than a decade. By 1941, the Soviet reserve pool contained 25.3 million people, 20 million reserve enlisted men and NCOs liable for mobilization, 1 million reserve officers, 14 million civilians who had undergone some form of military training through mass defense programs. Germany had spent the summer and autumn of 1941 destroying the Soviet army. What it had not done, what it could not have known to do, was destroy the reservoir behind it. The moment Germany crossed the frontier, the Soviet mobilization machine activated at a pace that has no parallel in history. Within 24 hours, mobilization orders went out across 11 time zones. Men reported to assembly points in cities still largely at peace, hundreds of miles from the front. Within weeks, new divisions were being formed, equipped from pre-positioned stockpiles. They were moved west by rail into a line that was still collapsing. Between June 23rd and December 31st, 1941, the Soviet state formed 182 rifle divisions, 62 tank brigades, 50 cavalry divisions, and dozens of artillery, anti-tank, and anti-aircraft formations. By the time of the Battle of Moscow, 6 months after the invasion, the Red Army numbered 8.9 million men. The original army had been destroyed. The new one was larger. Germany had killed or captured most of 5 million Soviet soldiers. The Red Army had responded by fielding 8 million. The entire arithmetic of destruction that Barbarossa rested on had simply failed, not because the plan was poorly executed, but because the reservoir Germany was draining was deeper than anyone in Berlin had imagined possible. The price of this was paid in blood with a deliberateness that is almost incomprehensible. These new divisions were not armies in any conventional sense. They were civilians in uniform, pulled from factories and collective farms and university classrooms and put on trains heading west. Their training was measured in weeks, not months. Many went into their first engagement with inadequate weapons and officers who had never commanded under fire. The Soviet state knew this. It committed them anyway. Not to win, but to buy time, to slow the German advance by the simplest possible calculus. A German soldier killing Soviet infantry was a German soldier not advancing. Every hour purchased cost lives. The purchase was made, the bills were paid, and the hours accumulated into weeks, and the weeks into something that began, very quietly, starting to look like survival. But men alone could not win this war. The question underneath the question was this: even if the Soviet Union could field an army of 8 million, could it arm them? The answer to that question was being forged literally 3,000 miles to the east. 2 days after the invasion, with German panzers already 200 miles into Soviet territory, a decision was made. The orders were simple in their impossibility. Move what you can, destroy what you can't. The Soviet Union would relocate its industrial base. The Western industrial regions, home to 85% of Soviet aircraft production, 9 tank factories, 70% of the country's coal, half its steel and aluminum, were in German hands or falling into them. If the factories stayed, they would be lost. If they moved, the present fighting would have to manage with diminishing supply while the future was assembled somewhere beyond German reach. The Council for Evacuation was established on June 24th. At its head, Lazar Kaganovich, Stalin's enforcer, The commissar who had overseen the collectivization campaigns that killed millions of Soviet peasants. He now turned the same mechanism of total state coercion toward a different purpose. The trains would move. The quotas would be met. The men who failed to meet them would learn the consequences. 3,000 rail cars per day evacuated steel manufacturing equipment from the Dnieper industrial region. In a single week in August, 26,000 rail cars evacuated factories from Ukraine alone. On the same tracks, in the opposite direction, soldiers by the millions moving west toward a front still collapsing. The railways ran in two directions simultaneously, 24 hours a day, through the autumn rains and the first hard frosts of winter, and what kept them running was less engineering than the application of unlimited pressure to anyone who might consider slowing down. Between July and November of 1941, 1,523 large industrial enterprises were relocated east, 667 of them to the Urals. The total movement encompassed more than 12 million people and millions of tons of machinery. It was possible because the alternative was losing. The machinery arrived at places like Chelyabinsk in the southern Ural Mountains, a city that would come to be known simply as Tankergrad, Tank City. Equipment from the Kirov works in Leningrad arrived alongside machinery from the great tank factory in Kharkov. But it was installed not in prepared buildings, but on whatever surface existed when the train stopped. Sometimes there were foundations, sometimes there was concrete, sometimes there was frozen ground. The workers who had ridden east with the machines, and those who met them there, were not the workers who had run these factories before. The men were at the front, or dead, or in German camps. By the end of 1942, more than half the workforce in Soviet war industry was women. A quarter were boys under 18 or men too old or broken for the front. Their shifts ran 12 hours, then 16, then however long it took to meet the quota. They slept on cots between the machines because going home, if home still existed, cost time the state had decided it could not afford. November 1941. The temperature east of the Urals has dropped below -20. On what passes for a factory floor in Chelyabinsk, concrete poured on frozen earth, open to the sky on three sides, walls still going up. A woman stands at a machine lathe, her hands wrapped against the cold, machining a hull component for a T-34 tank. There is no roof above her. The electricity for her machine was rerouted from an apartment building that is now dark. She has been working this shift for 14 hours. The war is 3,000 miles away. She cannot hear it. She does not need to. At this same moment, Soviet industrial production has fallen to less than half of what it was before the invasion. The factories are on trains or half assembled in snowfields or still under German air attack. And both catastrophes, military and industrial, have reached their worst simultaneously. This is the genuine bottom of the abyss, more dangerous in some ways than the military situation, because it is invisible. No one can see it on a map. There are no headlines for it. There is only the knowledge, held by the people running the Soviet war economy, that if the production curve does not reverse, nothing else will matter. It reverses. Tank plant number 183, evacuated in November, resumes T-34 production in December. Tank output climbs from 4,177 in the second half of 1941 to 11,021 in the first half of 1942. The factories are still being bolted together in snowfields. The tanks are rolling off lines that do not yet have roofs. The workers who were given 75 days to restart a steelworks in Chelyabinsk do it in 56, starting from frozen ground, working through the night, living in tents. It is often called a miracle. It was organized violence directed by a state against its own people, sustained by coercion and genuine patriotism in proportions that cannot now be separated. And it worked. The army filling with those tanks was not the army that had died in the summer of 1941. The pre-war Soviet military had been built around a doctrine of deep offensive operations, massive combined arms thrusts designed to disorganize an enemy's rear. Stalin's purges between 1937 and 1938 had killed most of the officers who designed that doctrine, because innovation in the atmosphere of those years was easily mistaken for heresy. And the armies that faced Barbarossa went into battle with commanders who had learned that the safest answer was always the most aggressive one. Constant counterattacks that wasted men against prepared German positions and solved nothing. The doctrines Stalin's purge had suppressed as threats to the state were the doctrines the Red Army now had to relearn in blood, under fire, over 2 years. The purges had also left, improbably, Zhukov, transferred from the catastrophe of the General Staff, to Leningrad in September 1941, then to Moscow in October. He arrives in the capital at the moment when panic is moving through its bureaucracy. Factory directors burning their files, officials preparing to flee. The announcement that Stalin is staying and Zhukov is in command is, by itself, a kind of weapon. It does not change the military situation, and it changes what people decide to do about whether to run. Smaller tank brigades replace the unwieldy corps destroyed in the summer. Dedicated anti-tank artillery formations are built specifically to counter German panzer tactics studied at catastrophic cost. Artillery is massed at corps level, concentrated rather than scattered thin. The T-34's gun is simplified from 861 components to 614. Cruder, faster to produce, just as lethal. At a ceremony underground in Moscow on November 6th, Stalin tells his generals that German blitzkrieg will fail because of vulnerabilities in the German rear, and that the Red Army's strength has been underestimated. Whether he believes it is a question history cannot resolve. He is, in any event, right. But none of it, not the reserves, not the factories, not the doctrinal reforms, would have stopped the German advance at Moscow without one more element. An element that had nothing to do with Soviet planning and everything to do with the decision made in Tokyo. Along the Soviet-Japanese border in the Far East, Stalin has maintained large formations of troops, fully trained, fully equipped, acclimatized to winter. They are there to deter a Japanese attack across Manchuria. As German forces close on Moscow in November 1941, he faces a calculation with no clean answer. Release those forces west and gamble that Japan will not attack, or hold them in place and possibly lose the capital. From Tokyo, a Soviet intelligence officer named Richard Sorg reports that Japan has decided to expand southward into the Pacific rather than north into Siberia. And whether Stalin trusts this fully, whether he acts on intelligence or instinct or some combination the record cannot separate, historians still argue. What is beyond argument is what he decides. The Siberian formations begin moving west. They arrive at the front in white camouflage smocks, on skis, carrying PPSH submachine guns, fully equipped for the cold that is incapacitating the German forces they are about to engage. To the Wehrmacht units who encounter them, they are an impossibility. An army conjured from empty air, from a direction German intelligence had been watching and found empty. Everything those soldiers had been told about the state of Soviet reserves is refuted in this moment by men skiing out of a snowstorm toward their lines. December 5th, 1941. Before dawn, minus 30 degrees Celsius. The 500,000 men Zhukov has assembled across a 200-mile front begin to move. 17 armies, built in secret, rested and equipped, advancing against German divisions that have been fighting without adequate winter gear for months, whose engine oil has frozen, whose frostbite casualties now outnumber their combat losses, whose supply lines have been declared adequate by a high command that announced the campaign essentially over. The counterattack pushes the Germans back 200 miles. By December, The invasion has cost the Wehrmacht over 210,000 killed and missing and 620,000 wounded. In January 1942, 8 of Germany's 162 divisions on the Eastern Front are rated fully capable for combat. The man who could see the Kremlin spires from a field in Khimki is retreating west now, through the same villages he passed going east, and past the equipment his unit abandoned to the cold, through a winter that is killing his army faster than any Soviet rifle. The war for Germany has quietly become something it was never built to fight, but it would be wrong and dishonest to mistake the counterattack at Moscow for the end of the story. In the summer of 1942, German forces reached the Volga and the Caucasus. Case Blue drives army groups south across the southern steppe toward Soviet oil the Wehrmacht cannot survive without. Catastrophic losses continue. The recovery is not smooth, not complete, and not linear. Each disaster of 1942 is less total than those of 1941. The Soviets are learning to preserve formations, to trade space for time with more discipline, but there are disasters. Lend-Lease arrives during this period, and the Soviet government would spend decades dismissing it. The honest accounting is more complicated. In 1941 and 1942, it is marginal. The Soviet Union survives on its own industrial output and its own blood. What the Americans eventually provide, more than 400,000 trucks and jeeps in a country whose factories have concentrated entirely on tanks and artillery and produced almost none, matters from 1943 onward in ways that cannot be dismissed. The deep offensive operations the Red Army executes from Kursk to Berlin are logistically possible, partly because American trucks are carrying their supplies. Lend-Lease does not save the Soviet Union, it helps it go forward. November 19, 1942, Operation Uranus. 2 Soviet armored spearheads drive through the Romanian forces on the flanks of the German 6th Army at Stalingrad and meet at Kalach, completing an encirclement of 300,000 men. It is Kiev in reverse, the same geometry, the same closing ring, executed by an army that had learned the technique from the army that used it against them. The 6th Army surrenders on February 2, 1943. The entire German strategic position in the East begins to shift. What Germany had built was the most lethal military machine in the history of warfare. What it had not built was the economic infrastructure to sustain it in a war it had expected to last 4 months. In mid-1941, Germany is producing 250 tanks per month. Insufficient to replace losses, let alone build toward the future. The Soviet Union, with its factories on trains, its workers machining parts in frozen fields, its electricity rerouted from dark apartment buildings, is producing more. By 1942, the USSR outproduces Germany in tanks 24,300 to 6,200. Germany's civilian economy remains largely intact, its war production still operating on peacetime assumptions about a conflict that was almost over. The conflict is not almost over. The gap between the 2 production curves is never closed. Less than 1,000 T-34s had existed at the start of Barbarossa. Most were lost in the first weeks, committed to battle piecemeal by half-trained crews following orders from commanders who did not yet understand what they were facing. In 1942 alone, Soviet factories produced 12,553. The tank that was nearly lost in the catastrophe of 1941, rebuilt in a frozen factory east of the Urals, simplified and re-engineered and rolled off lines that were still being assembled, becomes the most produced tank of the entire war. The T-34 production curve is, in a single image, the curve of the Soviet recovery. Where it goes, the war goes with it. After the war, Zhukov rides a white stallion into Red Square at the Victory Parade of June 1945. Within months, Stalin transfers him to a minor military district. The man who defended Leningrad, Moscow, and Stalingrad's flanks, who directed the assault on Berlin, who accepted Germany's unconditional surrender, is removed from prominence by the man he spent the war saving. Stalin had learned, over 4 years of catastrophe, to trust Zhukov. He had never stopped fearing him. By 1943, the factory at Chelyabinsk is enclosed, roofed, running at full capacity. The workers are still women and old men and boys. The conditions are still brutal. The T-34s rolling off the line now number in the thousands every month, and they will continue to do so until the last German signature is written and the guns in Europe go quiet. The workers on those lines will never know the names of the men who die in the tanks they build. The men who die in them will never know the names of the workers who built them. What passed between them was not personal. It was industrial and totalitarian, and it demanded everything they had, and then demanded more, and it changed the outcome of the war. What Germany destroyed in 1941 was an army. What it failed to destroy was the willingness and the capacity to build another one.